The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the bitter scent of wet pine and impending snow. Maeve stood in the frozen mud, her wool coat soaked through, her pockets lined with nothing but lint. She'd run out of road, run out of pride. The saloon doors swung shut, locking her out in the killing cold. That's when the giant of a man with eyes like chipped flint stopped his wagon. He didn't offer salvation. He just looked at her trembling shoulders, spat into the dirt and grunted, "Come home and eat supper." The mud in Bitter Creek didn't just coat your boots, it swallowed them. Maeve shifted her weight, feeling the icy slush seep through the cracked sole of her left shoe. It was a vicious, creeping cold that climbed up her ankles and settled deep in her shins. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the fabric was threadbare, smelling of wet sheep and desperation. Across the street, the Mercantile's heavy wooden door slammed shut. The slide of the iron bolt echoed like a gunshot in the thinning twilight. Maeve stared at the window. The warm, yellow glow of the oil lamp inside was extinguished a second later. She was alone. She pressed her back against the rough, splintered siding of the assay office. The wood was damp, offering no warmth, only a windbreak against the gale tearing down the mountain pass. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands. She wasn't going to cry. Crying burned energy, and she had none left to spare. It had been 2 days since the stagecoach left her behind. 2 days since she realized the leather purse tucked into her bodice had been slit open and emptied by the very woman who had offered her a peppermint stick at the last station. A stray dog trotted past, its ribs showing through a matted coat. It didn't even look at her. It knew better than to expect anything from a ghost standing in the sleet. Down the boardwalk, heavy boots struck the planks. A rhythmic, unhurried thud. Maeve shrank back into the shadows. In a mining town like this, a lone woman in the dark was prey. She slipped her right hand into her coat pocket, wrapping her frozen, numb fingers around the heavy brass handle of a letter opener. It was dull, useless, really, but it was metal, and it was hers. The man stepped off the boardwalk and into the muck of the street. He was enormous, entirely out of proportion with the stunted, wind-whipped pines that surrounded the town. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat, the fur patchy and worn down to the cracked leather at the elbows. A slouch hat was pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He was wrestling a 50-pound sack of grain into the back of a battered buckboard wagon, hitched to 2 miserable-looking mules. The mules snorted, their breath pluming white in the freezing air. The man tossed the sack over the tailgate. It hit the wooden bed with a heavy, dead thump. Maeve shivered. A violent, full-body spasm that rattled her teeth. The man stopped. He turned his head. Maeve held her breath, gripping the letter opener tighter. His face was a landscape of coarse brown hair and weathered skin, creased deeply at the corners of his eyes. He didn't look malicious. He didn't look kind, either. He looked completely indifferent. He reached into the back of the wagon, pulled a heavy canvas tarp over the supplies, and tied it down with thick, calloused hands. The coarse rope rasped against the iron cleats. "Store's closed," he said. His voice sounded like 2 rough stones grinding together. "I know," Maeve forced out. Her voice was thin, reedy. It lacked the haughty finishing school polish she usually relied on as armor. The man finished the knot. He didn't move to get into the driver's seat. He just stood there in the mud, letting the sleet gather on the brim of his hat. He looked at her ruined leather shoes, the hem of her skirt caked in frozen muck, and the violent shaking of her shoulders. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where her husband was, or why she was standing outside a closed store in a blizzard. "You're going to freeze to death against that wall." "I'll manage," Maeve lied, her jaw tight. The man snorted, a brief exhale of breath that might have been a laugh if it carried any humor. He walked around to the front of the wagon, checking the mules' harnesses. Suit yourself. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Maeve's chest. He was leaving. The last living soul on the street was leaving, and she was going to die here. The realization wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was just a heavy, sinking stone in her gut. She took a step forward, her boot tearing free from the mud with a wet, sucking sound. Wait. The man paused, his hand on the reins. He looked back at her, Maeve's throat convulsed. The words tasted like ash. I don't have anywhere to go. The wind kicked up, howling through the slats of the boardwalk, throwing a handful of ice crystals against her cheek. They stung like tiny needles. The man watched her for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't soften. His gaze was analytical, assessing a stray animal. Then he let go of the reins and walked back to the tailgate. He unlatched it, letting it drop with a clatter. "Come home and eat supper," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a gentle invitation. It was a directive. Maeve stared at him. She thought of the letter opener in her pocket. She thought of the stories of men in the mountains, men who hadn't seen civilization in years. But then the wind bit through her wet clothes again, sinking straight into the marrow of her bones. If he killed her, at least it would be indoors. She dragged herself toward the wagon. The wagon bed smelled of raw, wet canvas, axle grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold iron. Maeve huddled in the corner, wedged between a crate of what smelled like dried apples and the sack of grain. The man, he hadn't offered a name, and she hadn't asked, had tossed her a stiff woolen blanket before climbing into the driver's seat. It smelled heavily of wood smoke and old sweat, but she wrapped it around herself like a second skin. The journey was a brutal, bone-jarring ordeal. The buckboard lacked springs, and every rock, every rut in the frozen mountain trail transmitted a sharp shock straight up her spine. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad, immovable back of the man driving. He sat stoic, shoulders hunched against the driving snow, occasionally clicking his tongue or slapping the leathers against the mule's rumps. They were climbing. The air grew thinner, the cold more absolute. The pine trees pressed close against the sides of the trail, their branches heavy with snow, occasionally scraping against the canvas tarp with a sound like tearing fabric. Maeve's initial relief faded, replaced by a creeping, paranoid dread. She was entirely at his mercy. He could stop the wagon right now, drag her into the trees, and leave her for the wolves. No one in Bitter Creek knew she existed. No one would look for her. Her fingers nervously traced the cold brass of the letter opener through the fabric of her coat. It was a pathetic comfort, but she gripped it until her knuckles ached. "Who are you?" she asked, the words snatched away by the wind the moment they left her mouth. She didn't think he heard her. A moment later, he spoke without turning around. "Boone." "I'm Maeve," she offered, her voice shaky. He didn't reply. They rode in silence for another hour. The sleet turned to heavy, fat flakes of snow, blanketing the trail and muffling the sound of the mule's hooves. The darkness was absolute, save for a small kerosene lantern swinging erratically from the side of the wagon box, casting long, distorted shadows against the tree trunks. Maeve's teeth chattered violently. Her feet were completely numb. She tried to wiggle her toes inside her soaked boots, but felt nothing. Panic flared again. Frostbite. If she lost a foot, she was as good as dead. A crippled woman with no money in the West was a corpse breathing borrowed air. Are we close?" she asked, hating the pathetic waver in her voice. "Mules smell the barn," Boone replied. 10 minutes later, the trees broke. The wagon lurched into a small clearing. Through the curtain of falling snow, Maeve saw the dark, squared-off shape of a cabin. It wasn't much more than logs chinked with mud and a sharply pitched roof, but a thin ribbon of smoke was lazily curling from the stone chimney. Boone pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" He climbed down, his boots crunching heavily in the snow. He walked to the back of the wagon and dropped the tailgate. "Get down," he said. Maeve tried to stand, but her legs were utterly useless. Her knees buckled the moment she put weight on them. She grabbed the side of the wagon, gasping as her frozen muscles protested. Boone sighed. It was a heavy sound of mild inconvenience. He stepped closer, reaching up and wrapping two massive hands around her waist. His grip was entirely functional, devoid of any gentleness, like he was moving a sack of feed. He lifted her out of the wagon and set her on the snowy ground. Her legs gave out immediately. Before she could hit the snow, Boone caught her by the arm. His grip was like a vice, bruising her bicep through the wool of her coat. "Feet don't work," he muttered, assessing the situation. Without another word, he scooped her up. One arm under her knees, the other around her back. Maeve gasped, instinctively throwing her arms around his thick neck to steady herself. He smelled powerfully of wet wool, pine pitch, and the faint, coppery scent of dried blood on his sleeve. He didn't struggle under her weight. He carried her up the 3 wooden steps to the porch, kicked the heavy slab door open with his boot, and carried her inside. The darkness of the cabin was heavy, smelling of cold ash and stale tobacco. Boone deposited her unceremoniously into a high-backed wooden rocking chair near the stone hearth. The sudden removal of his body heat left her shivering even harder. "Take your boots off," he commanded, striking a match against the stone fireplace. Maeve fumbled with her frozen laces, her fingers completely unresponsive. She watched him touch the match to a pile of kindling already laid in the grate. The yellow flame licked at the dry moss, then caught the pine twigs. The smell of wood smoke instantly filled the room. Boone turned back to her, watching her struggle with the wet leather knots. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her, and swatted her hands away. Maeve stiffened, her breath catching in her throat, as a stranger's massive hands wrapped around her ruined shoes. But he didn't linger. He worked the wet knots with surprising dexterity, peeling the soaked leather away from her feet. Her stockings were saturated and freezing. He pulled those off too. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, mortified by the intimacy of it, by the pale, icy blue color of her toes. "Don't put 'em near the fire," Boone said, standing up and tossing her wet boots toward the door. "They'll thaw too fast. Hurts like a son of a bitch." He walked over to a heavy oak table, striking another match to light an oil lamp. The golden light flared, revealing the cabin. It was fiercely pragmatic. A heavy cast-iron stove in the corner, shelves lined with jars of preserved goods, animal traps hanging from the rafters. A single, narrow cot against the far wall covered in a heavy bear hide. There was only one bed. Maeve swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to draw her bare, freezing feet away from the direct heat of the growing fire. Boone didn't look at her. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from a hook, set it on the grate over the fire, and walked to a wooden larder. "Said you'd get supper," he muttered. "Ain't much. But it's hot." The sound of thick-cut salt pork hitting the hot iron skillet was the loudest thing in the room. It hissed and popped, sending tiny droplets of hot grease into the fire, making the flames flare bright orange. Maeve sat in the rocking chair, her entire body rigid. As her extremities slowly began to thaw, a deep, burning ache replaced the numbness. It felt like someone was driving hot needles into the soles of her feet and the tips of her fingers. She clenched her jaw, refusing to make a sound, watching Boone cook. He moved with an economy of motion that only comes from years of solitude. He didn't waste a single step. He sliced half an onion with a wicked-looking hunting knife, the blade flashing in the firelight, and scraped the pieces into the rendering fat. The sharp, pungent smell of the onion hitting the grease hit Maeve's stomach like a physical blow. Her stomach cramped violently, letting out a loud, hollow rumble. Boone didn't look up, but he reached into a tin canister, pulled out a handful of dried beans, and tossed them into a small iron pot, adding water from a bucket by the door. He set the pot on the edge of the coals. "Takes a while to boil," he said quietly. "I can wait," Maeve rasped. She lied. She felt like she could eat the leather of her boots. It had been nearly 48 hours since she'd had anything more than a handful of snow. Boone took a thick, stale loaf of bread from a cloth sack. He cut 2 thick slices, dropping them straight onto the hot stones near the edge of the fire to toast. Maeve watched him. She looked for a tell, a glance at her exposed ankles, a lingering stare, anything that would indicate what he wanted from her. Men always wanted something. Her father had wanted obedience. Her former fiancé had wanted a pretty ornament for his parlor. The men in the mining camps wanted flesh. Boone seemed to want nothing. He stared at the bubbling fat in the skillet. After 10 agonizing minutes, he used a rag to lift the skillet off the fire. He grabbed 2 battered tin plates from a shelf, slid a piece of charred bread onto each, and dumped half the greasy pork and onions over the bread. He walked over and handed her a plate and a fork. The heat radiating from the tin burned her palms, but she didn't let go. She looked down at the food. It wasn't a delicate meal. It was heavy, greasy, and smelled like heaven. Boone took his plate, sat on a heavy wooden stump on the opposite side of the hearth, and began to eat. He didn't look at her to see if she liked it. He just shoveled the food into his mouth with blunt efficiency. Maeve tried to take a polite bite. She picked up a piece of the pork with her fork, brought it to her mouth, and chewed. The hot grease coated her tongue, salty and rich. Her control snapped. She forgot the finishing school. She forgot the posture lessons. The primal, desperate animal inside her took over. She practically tore at the bread, shoving the pork and onions into her mouth, chewing fast and swallowing hard. She burned the roof of her mouth, the blister forming instantly, but she didn't care. She used her fingers to wipe the remaining grease from the tin plate, licking them clean. When she was finished, her plate spotless, she sat back, breathless. Her stomach felt heavy, achingly full, a dull warmth finally radiating outward from her core. She looked up. Boone was watching her. His own plate was resting on his knee, half-eaten. He was staring at her with those pale, flinty eyes. Maeve felt a flush of deep humiliation crawl up her neck. She lowered her gaze, wiping her mouth with the back of her wrist, realizing her chin was slick with grease. I'm sorry. I was hungry," Boone finished for her. He looked back at his plate and took another bite. "Ain't a sin to be hungry." The silence returned, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the wind throwing snow against the window panes. Maeve set her empty plate on the floor. The warmth of the room, combined with the heavy food in her stomach, was making her eyelids unbearably heavy. The exhaustion of the past 2 days was catching up to her, dragging her down like an undertow. She looked at the single cot in the corner of the room. Then she looked back at Boone. Where do I sleep?" she asked, her voice tight. This was the moment, the price for the ride and the supper. Boone stood up. He set his plate on the table, walked over to a cedar chest at the foot of his bed, and opened it. He pulled out a massive, heavy quilt made of mismatched fabric squares. He walked back to her and tossed it onto her lap. It was heavy enough to knock the breath out of her. "Chair," he said, "or the floor near the hearth. Floor's harder, but it's warmer." Maeve blinked. "And you?" "My bed," he said, stating the obvious. He walked over to the door, checked the heavy iron bolt, and then walked to the lamp. He blew it out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the orange glow of the dying fire. Maeve heard the rustle of clothing, the heavy creak of the rope springs on the cot, and then the sound of Boone settling in. She sat in the rocking chair, clutching the heavy quilt to her chest. She listened to the wind outside. She listened to the deep, even breathing of the massive man in the dark across the room. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't asked for a thing. For the first time since she stepped off that stagecoach, Maeve felt a tear break loose. It slid down her cheek, hot and fast, cutting a track through the dirt and soot on her face. She pulled the quilt over her head, curled into a tight ball in the wooden chair, and cried silently into the dark. It wasn't out of fear. It was the overwhelming, terrifying realization that, for tonight at least, she was safe. Morning did not arrive with a gentle dawn. It hit the frost-caked windows like a broadside of blinding, dead-white glare. Maeve woke with a sharp intake of breath, her neck cramped at a vicious angle against the hard wooden back of the rocking chair. For 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. She smelled sharp chicory coffee, old leather, and the heavy, metallic scent of cold ash. Then the dull throb in her feet registered, and the memory of the muddy street in Bitter Creek crashed down on her. She opened her eyes. The cabin was freezing. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers, throwing just enough heat to keep the water bucket by the door from freezing solid. Boone was already awake. He sat at the heavy oak table, his massive back to her, working a whetstone in slow, rhythmic circles over the curved blade of a hatchet. Scrape! Shh! Scrape! Shh! The sound set her teeth on edge. Maeve moved, and her joints cracked like dry kindling. Her body felt bruised, battered by the stagecoach, the freezing mud, and the unyielding chair. She pulled the heavy, mismatched quilt tighter around her shoulders, shivering as the cold morning air hit the damp, sweat-stained collar of her dress. Boone didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the stove. Grounds are thick. Chew 'em if you want to." His voice was a low gravel rumble, completely devoid of morning pleasantries. Maeve gingerly stood up. Her feet screamed in protest. The flesh was tender, swollen, and mottled purple. She took a tentative step onto the freezing floorboards, wincing as a sharp pain shot up her heel. She limped to the cast-iron stove. A battered blue enamel pot sat on the warming plate. She poured a cup, the dark liquid sludging into the tin mug. She took a sip. It was brutally bitter, tasting of burnt wood and cheap chicory, but it was hot. It sent a vital, burning trail down her throat to her stomach. She stood there, clutching the mug with both hands, letting the steam warm her nose. She looked down at herself. Her dress, once a respectable navy wool, was ruined, caked in dried mud at the hem, wrinkled beyond repair, smelling of wet sheep and unwashed bodies. Her hair, which she usually kept pinned in tight, neat coils, hung in greasy, tangled strands around her face. She felt a sudden, violent surge of shame. In her old life, she wouldn't have let a servant see her like this, let alone a man. She had been raised to be an immaculate porcelain doll, right up until the creditors came and the porcelain shattered. Now, she was a beggar in a filthy dress, drinking mud water in a stranger's shack. "I need to—" Maeve started, her voice raspy from disuse. She stopped, the humiliation burning her cheeks. She had to relieve herself, and the thought of asking this giant where to go made her stomach twist. Boone paused the whetstone. He pointed the handle of the hatchet toward the back corner of the room, near his cot. "Curtain. Pot's behind it. Don't go outside. Wind's picking up. You'll lose your way 10 feet from the door and freeze." Maeve stared at the canvas curtain, hung on a sagging wire. The degradation was absolute, but her bladder was aching. She limped over, pulled the stiff canvas aside, and handled her business in agonizing, mortifying silence. She prayed the howling wind outside masked the sounds. When she emerged, she felt a profound, heavy exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Boone hadn't moved. He was testing the edge of the hatchet against the rough pad of his thumb. Maeve walked back toward the stove. She wanted to be useful. She needed to earn her space, lest he change his mind and throw her back out into the snow. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the skillet he'd used last night, intending to scrape the congealed grease. Her fingers, still numb and clumsy, slipped, The heavy iron pan hit the floorboards with a deafening clang. Maeve jumped, a hard flinch that sent a jolt of panic through her chest. "I'm sorry," she gasped, dropping to her knees to grab the handle. "I'm sorry, I was just trying to—" "Leave it!" Boone snapped. Maeve froze on the floor. Her breath hitched. She waited for the blow, or the yell, or the curse. The men she knew threw things when they were interrupted. They struck out when their morning peace was broken. Boone stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked over to her. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He reached down, clamped his massive hand around her upper arm, and pulled her to her feet with zero effort. "Hands are soft," he muttered, looking at her pale, trembling fingers. "Skin's frozen. You grab cold iron, you'll tear the hide right off your palms. Sit down." He didn't wait for her to argue. He picked up the skillet, grabbed a rag, and went to work on it himself. Maeve retreated to the rocking chair. She sat rigidly, clutching the tin mug. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't even raised his voice past a grumble. But his assessment stung worse than a slap. Hands are soft. Useless. She was entirely, completely useless in this world, and they both knew it. By noon, the blizzard hit with full, terrifying force. It wasn't just snow. It was an assault. The wind shrieked around the eaves of the cabin like a dying animal, making the heavy log walls shudder. The sky turned a suffocating, bruised gray, and the snow blew sideways, packing against the windows until the glass was completely obscured by solid white ice. The cabin, which had felt sparse and empty the night before, suddenly felt the size of a coffin. Maeve paced. 2 steps from the hearth to the table, 2 steps back. The rhythmic creak of the floorboards was the only thing keeping her grounded. Boone was fixing a broken leather harness. He sat on the floor near the stove, an awl and heavy waxed thread in his hands. He worked in complete silence, the muscle in his jaw jumping rhythmically as he pulled the thick thread tight. He had been working on it for 2 hours. He hadn't spoken a single word. The silence was making Maeve claw at her own skin. She was used to noise. The chatter of drawing rooms, the clinking of teacups, the shouting of peddlers in the street, the angry, drunken ranting of the man she had run away from. Silence, to Maeve, meant a predator was stalking. "Do you ever talk?" she demanded. The words tore out of her throat before she could stop them. Boone didn't look up. He punched the awl through the thick leather. "Shuck. Talk when there's something needs saying." "And nothing needs saying?" Maeve let out a short, jagged laugh. It sounded unhinged, even to her own ears. "We are trapped in a wooden box while the world ends outside, and you are acting like it's a sunny Tuesday in July." Boone pulled the thread through. It's just winter. Happens every year." "I am going crazy," she hissed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to yell, to argue, to do something human. "I am staring at a wall of ice. I smell like stale grease, and my feet feel like they are on fire." Boone finally stopped. He laid the leather harness across his knees and looked up at her. His flinty eyes tracked slowly over her trembling frame, taking in her clenched fists, her pale face, the wild tangle of her hair. "You're alive," he said flatly. "Yesterday you were fixing to die against a wall. Today you're warm enough to complain about the smell." The blunt truth of it hit her like a physical blow. The fight drained out of her instantly, leaving behind a hollow, sickening wave of shame. She swayed on her feet, the sudden drop in adrenaline making her lightheaded. Boone sighed. It was the same heavy, inconvenienced sound he'd made when her legs gave out in the snow. He tossed the harness onto the table and stood up. He walked to the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, rummaged inside, and pulled out a heavy flannel shirt. It was a faded, washed-out red, smelling of lye soap and cedar shavings. He threw it at her. It hit her in the chest, and she scrambled to catch it. "Take that wet dress off," he ordered, turning his back to her and walking to the stove. He grabbed an iron poker and started jabbing violently at the coals. "Hang it near the fire. Don't put it too close, or it'll singe." Maeve stared at his broad back. "Take my dress off? It's damp. Damp kills in this air." He didn't turn around. "Ain't looking at you. Put the shirt on." Maeve hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her armor on, no matter how wet and heavy it was. But the cold dampness of the wool was seeping into her bones, bringing a deep, marrow-deep ache. She turned away from him, facing the dark corner. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the tiny, stiff buttons down the front of her bodice. The fabric was stiff with dried mud and sweat. It took agonizing minutes, her breath catching every time the wind howled or Boone shifted near the stove. She peeled the heavy dress off her shoulders, letting it drop to the floor in a sad, wet heap. She was left in her cotton chemise and petticoats, which were equally damp and filthy. Shivering violently, she pulled Boone's flannel shirt over her head. It swallowed her. The hem hit her just above the knees, and the sleeves hung inches past her fingertips. It was rough against her skin, heavy and warm. She hurriedly rolled the sleeves up, exposing her bruised wrists, and picked up her ruined dress. She draped it over the back of the rocking chair, pulling it closer to the hearth. When she turned around, Boone was looking at her. He didn't look at her bare legs protruding from the bottom of his shirt, or the thin, damp cotton of her petticoat peeking through the unbuttoned front. He looked at her face. "Better?" he asked. Maeve pulled the collar of the shirt tighter around her neck. She felt entirely exposed, yet bizarrely safe. The shirt smelled like him, wood smoke, pine, and a clean, masculine sweat. It was an intimate, overwhelming scent. "Yes," she whispered, looking at the floorboards. "Thank you." Boone gave a short, single nod. He sat back down on the floor, picked up the awl and went back to his harness. The silence returned, but this time the teeth had been pulled from it. It wasn't a stalking predator anymore. It was just quiet. The daylight died by 3 in the afternoon, swallowed by the storm. Boone lit the oil lamp, casting long, jumping shadows across the log walls. The temperature in the cabin had dropped significantly. The wind was finding every microfissure in the mud, chinking, pushing thin blades of freezing air into the room. Maeve sat close to the stove, her knees pulled to her chest beneath the hem of Boone's massive shirt. She watched him work. He had moved from mending leather to cleaning a heavy, lever-action rifle. The smell of gun oil mixed with the wood smoke. He moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. Strip the bolt, wipe the bore, oil the mechanism. He didn't rush. He had the patience of a stone. Maeve watched his hands. They were massive, scarred, the knuckles thick and calloused. She caught sight of a thick, jagged line of pale flesh running up his left forearm, disappearing beneath the rolled sleeve of his long johns. It didn't look like a knife wound. It looked like something had tried to tear the meat from the bone. He caught her staring. He didn't cover the scar. He just kept wiping the iron barrel. "Bear," he said, his voice quiet over the wind. Maeve blinked, startled that he had initiated a conversation. "A grizzly? Cougar." Boone set the rag down. 5 years back. Caught me gutting a deer in the brush. Didn't hear her coming." Maeve looked at the scar, then up to his face. "Did you kill it?" Boone let out a dry, humorless snort. "Took half my arm and a piece of my thigh. I bled out in the snow for 3 hours before I could crawl back to my horse. Mules brought me down the mountain." He looked down at the rifle. "Cougar got the deer. I got the scar. Fair trade, I reckon." It was a terrifying story, delivered with the casual boredom of a man discussing the weather. Maeve pulled her arms tighter around her legs. "You didn't want to leave? After that?" Go somewhere. Safer? Boone looked at her. The oil lamp caught the amber flecks in his dark eyes. Safer where? Cities are full of men. Men are worse than cats. Cats just want to eat. Men want to own you. The word struck Maeve square in the chest. They bypassed her ribs and settled cold and heavy in her lungs. Men want to own you. She looked away, staring into the bright orange coals through the grate of the stove. The flames twisted and danced. In them she saw Arthur's face, perfectly manicured mustache, gold pocket watch, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The way his hand had tightened around her neck when she told him she wouldn't sign over her father's remaining shares. She absent-mindedly reached up, her fingers grazing the base of her throat. The yellowing bruises were hidden beneath the collar of Boone's shirt, but she could still feel the phantom pressure of Arthur's thumbs. Boone watched her hand. He saw the way she touched her neck, the way her eyes went completely hollow and distant. He recognized that look. He had seen it on dying animals, and he had seen it in the mirror. He didn't ask. Instead, he stood up, setting the rifle on the table. He walked to the corner, grabbed a large, galvanized tin tub, and dragged it to the center of the room, right in front of the hearth. It scraped loudly against the wood. Maeve snapped out of her memory, her heart hammering. "What are you doing?" Boone went to the stove, grabbed the 2 heavy iron kettles he had put on earlier, and carried them to the tub. Steam billowed up as he poured the boiling water into the tin. He grabbed the cold water bucket from the door and dumped half of it in to temper the heat. "Water's hot," Boone said. He walked over to a shelf, pulled down a rough linen towel and a block of yellow lye soap, and set them on the edge of the tub. "You smell like a wet dog." "Wash." Maeve stared at the steaming water. A hot bath. It was an impossible luxury, a hallucination in the middle of a blizzard. But the tub was in the dead center of a one-room cabin. "I can't," she stammered, her face burning hot. "You're right here." Boone didn't roll his eyes, but his heavy sigh communicated his irritation. He walked past her, grabbing his heavy buffalo coat and his slouch hat from the peg by the door. He shoved his arms into the thick sleeves. "Where are you going?" Panic spiked in her chest. "You said the wind." "Lean to," he interrupted, pulling his hat down tight. "Got firewood needs stacking. Take your time. Yell when you're decent. Don't fall asleep in the tub and drown." He unbolted the heavy door. The wind roared into the cabin, instantly stealing the warmth and blowing snow halfway across the floor. Boone slipped out into the howling white void, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The slam of the bolt sliding home from the outside echoed in the quiet cabin. Maeve was alone. She stood up, her legs trembling. She approached the tub. The steam rose in thick, inviting plumes. She stripped off Boone's shirt, letting it fall to the floor. She untied her petticoats and slipped out of her chemise. The cold air of the cabin bit into her bare skin, raising gooseflesh across her arms and thighs. She stood completely naked in the firelight. Without her heavy woolen armor, she looked frail. Her ribs showed too clearly beneath her pale skin. Purple and yellow bruises mottled her hips from the stagecoach ride, and a dark, thumb-shaped bruise stained the pale skin of her collarbone. She stepped into the tub. The water was brutally hot, bordering on painful, but she sank into it with a stifled sob. The heat enveloped her, melting the agonizing tension in her muscles, drawing the deep-seated chill from her bones. It was so intense, so overwhelmingly comforting, that it brought tears to her eyes. She grabbed the block of rough lye soap. It smelled sharp and caustic, stripped of any perfume or lavender. She scrubbed at her skin until it turned pink. She washed the mud from her legs, the grime from her neck, the cold sweat of fear from her chest. She submerged her head, letting the hot water soak into the matted tangles of her hair, working the soap through the heavy strands until they were clean and squeaking. When the water began to turn tepid, she stood up, shivering violently as the cold air hit her wet skin. She grabbed the rough linen towel and dried herself frantically, her teeth chattering. She pulled her damp chemise back on. It was cold and unpleasant, but it was all she had, and then pulled Boone's giant red flannel shirt back over her head. She toweled her hair as best she could, wringing the water onto the floorboards. She felt raw, scrubbed clean of the road, clean of the mud. She walked to the door, hesitating with her hand hovering over the wood. She felt a strange, twisting tightness in her chest. He had gone out into a deadly blizzard so she could bathe. He was probably freezing to death in a drafty wood shed. She pounded on the heavy timber. "I'm finished," she yelled, her voice cracking. 10 seconds later, the bolt rattled. The door shoved open, pushing a foot of accumulated snow inward. Boone stepped inside, bringing a blast of Arctic air with him. His heavy coat was caked in solid white ice. Frost clung to his eyebrows and his beard. He looked like a golem made of winter. He pushed the door shut, leaning his massive weight against it to force it closed against the wind, and threw the bolt. He didn't look at her. He stood on the mat, shedding his frozen coat, knocking the ice from his boots. Maeve stood by the stove, clutching the towel, watching him. "You must be freezing," she said quietly. Boone hung his coat. He turned around. His face was pale from the cold, his cheeks flushed dark red. He looked at her. Her face was scrubbed clean, her dark hair hanging in damp, clean waves over the shoulders of his red shirt. She didn't look like a muddy stray anymore. He walked over to the tub, grabbed the handles, and without a word, dragged the heavy, water-filled tin to the door. He opened it a crack, dumped the dirty water out into the snow, and slammed the door shut again. "Wood stacked," he said, walking to the fire and holding his large, numb hands out to the heat. He didn't look at her again. "Go to sleep." The storm did not break. It settled into a grinding, monotonous siege that erased the concept of day and night. By the third morning, the damp chill Maeve had carried in her bones since the stagecoach finally exacted its toll. It didn't start with a cough. It started with a subtle, creeping ache in her lower back that spread outward, turning her muscles to water and her joints to ground glass. She sat in the rocking chair, huddled under the heavy quilt, staring blindly at the flames in the stove. She was shivering, but her skin felt tight and hot. She clamped her jaw shut, determined not to let her teeth chatter. Boone was at the table, painstakingly oiling his leather boots with a rag and a tin of rendered fat. He had enough to worry about without a sickly stray freezing to death in his parlor. A dry, scratching tickle formed in the back of her throat. Maeve swallowed hard, trying to force it down. She took a shallow breath, but it caught. She coughed. It was a harsh, rattling sound that tore through the quiet cabin like tearing canvas. Boone's hand stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He slowly set the tin of grease down on the table, wiped his fingers on the rag, and turned his head. Maeve coughed again, doubling over as a sharp pain spiked behind her ribs. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes watering from the sheer force of it. When she finally caught her breath, she looked up, her vision swimming slightly. Boone was standing over her. He didn't ask how she felt. The question was irrelevant. She looked like death. He reached out and pressed the back of his massive, calloused hand against her forehead. His skin was rough, smelling faintly of leather and gun oil, but it felt blessedly, shockingly cool against her burning flesh. "Fever," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "I'm fine," Maeve rasped, hating the weak, reedy sound of her own voice. "Just swallowed a draft." Boone ignored the lie. He turned on his heel and walked to the shelves lining the far wall. He grabbed a small, unmarked glass jar filled with stripped, dried bark, taking a pinch of it and tossing it into a tin cup. He poured boiling water from the kettle over it. "Get in the bed," he ordered. Maeve blinked through the haze of the fever. "The cot? No, I can't take your—" "Get in the bed," Boone repeated. His voice didn't rise in volume, but the absolute authority in it pinned her to the chair. "You die in that rocker. I gotta dig a hole in frozen ground. Ground's like iron right now. Ain't doing it." It was a brutal, pragmatic logic that somehow bypassed her pride entirely. She nodded weakly, pushing the heavy quilt off her lap. She tried to stand, but her legs were utterly useless. Her knees buckled the moment she put weight on them, her vision tunneling into dark, swimming spots. Boone caught her before she hit the floorboards. Once again, he scooped her up. She felt weightless, hollowed out by the heat radiating from her own core. He carried her to the narrow cot in the corner and laid her down on the rough wool blankets. He pulled the heavy bear hide up over her shoulders. It smelled powerfully of musk, dust, and him. He walked back to the stove, grabbed the tin cup, and returned to the cot. "Drink," he said, holding the cup to her lips. Maeve took a sip and nearly gagged. It was impossibly bitter, a sharp, earthy taste that coated her tongue in ash. "What is that?" she choked out, pushing his hand away. "Willow bark. Brings the fire down in the blood. Drink it." He didn't offer a sugar cube to chase it. He held the cup steady against her bottom lip until she swallowed every foul drop. The moment the cup was empty, he set it on the floor and walked away, grabbing his heavy coat. "Stay under the hide," he commanded over his shoulder as he unbolted the door. For the next 24 hours, Maeve floated in a disjointed nightmare of heat and shivering cold. She dreamt of the stagecoach, the endless jolting, the sneer on Arthur's face as he snapped his gold pocket watch shut. She dreamt of the mud in Bitter Creek rising up to swallow her waist, her chest, her throat. She thrashed violently, kicking the heavy bear hide away, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. Strong hands caught her wrists. "Hold still." Maeve blinked her eyes open. The cabin was dark, save for the dull orange glow of the banked fire. Boone was sitting on a wooden crate next to the cot. He had a bowl of melted snow in his lap and a damp rag in his hand. He pressed the freezing cloth to her forehead, wiping away the slick sheen of sweat. Maeve whimpered, leaning into the cold. Her heavy flannel shirt, his shirt, was soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to her burning skin. She moved her head, the collar of the shirt slipping down her shoulder. Boone dipped the rag back into the icy water, wrung it out, and moved to press it against her neck. His hand stopped in midair, in the dim light of the dying fire. The dark, mottled bruises on her collarbone and the base of her throat were stark and undeniable. They were the distinct shape of a man's fingers and thumb, pressed deep into the pale flesh. Maeve felt the sudden stillness in the room. The fever fog parted just enough for her to realize her collar was open. Panic, sharp and jagged, pierced her chest. She snatched the heavy hide and yanked it up to her chin, her breathing shallow and erratic. Boone didn't move. He stared at the spot where the bruises had been. His jaw locked, the muscles jumping beneath his beard. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, heavier than the blizzard outside. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't ask if she deserved it. He slowly lowered his hand, dipping the rag back into the cold water. "Fever's breaking," he said quietly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in his chest. "Go back to sleep." He didn't touch her neck again. He folded the cold rag and laid it carefully across her forehead. He sat in the dark, watching the door, his hand resting casually near the heavy iron lever of his rifle. The silence woke her. It was a vast, hollow quiet that made her ears ring. The relentless, shrieking assault of the wind against the logs had stopped. Maeve opened her eyes. The cabin was flooded with a blinding, pure white light reflecting off the snowpack outside the window panes. She squeezed her eyes shut, groaning as a dull, throbbing headache pulsed behind her temples. but the fire was gone. Her skin felt cool, clammy with dried sweat, but the terrifying, consuming heat of the fever had vanished. She turned her head on the flat feather pillow. Boone was at the stove. The smell of strong coffee and rendering bacon fat filled the air, anchoring her to reality. He had his back to her, scraping the heavy cast-iron skillet with a metal spatula. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her muscles trembled, utterly exhausted, but they obeyed. "The storm," she croaked, her throat raw and dry. Boone glanced over his shoulder. "Blew itself out an hour before dawn." He plated the bacon and 2 thick slices of fried bread, walked over, and handed her the tin plate. He didn't ask how she felt. He expected her to eat. Maeve took the plate, resting it on her knees. She picked up a piece of bacon, her hands shaking slightly, and took a bite. It tasted like salvation. She ate slowly, letting the heavy grease and salt settle her hollow stomach. Boone took his own plate and sat on the wooden stump near the hearth. He ate in his usual, efficient silence. The light in the cabin was unforgiving. It highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, the deep wear in the floorboards, and the stark exhaustion carved into the lines around Boone's eyes. He hadn't slept. Not since her fever spiked. Maeve set her half-empty plate on the floor beside the cot. She pulled the bear hide tight across her lap, her fingers tracing the coarse fur. His name was Arthur. The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped into a deep well. Maeve hadn't planned to speak. She didn't want to explain herself. But the memory of Boone's eyes locked on her bruised neck the night before demanded a reckoning. Boone didn't stop eating. He didn't look at her. He chewed his bread, swallowed, and stared at the iron stove door. "Didn't ask." "I know," Maeve said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you saw." Boone set his plate down on the floor between his boots. He rested his heavy forearms on his knees, lacing his thick, scarred fingers together. "Seen a lot of things. Most of 'em ain't my business. My father owed him money," Maeve continued, the dam breaking. She stared at her pale, trembling hands in her lap. "A lot of it. Mining shares that went bust. Arthur bought the debt. He came to the house in Denver, said the debt could be forgiven. All I had to do was wear his ring and smile for his associates." She let out a dry, bitter laugh that caught in her throat. "I thought I could do it. I thought it was a transaction. But Arthur didn't want a wife. He wanted a dog he could kick when the market closed down." She instinctively touched the collar of the flannel shirt, pulling it tighter against her throat. "I packed a single valise, stole the petty cash from his desk drawer while he was drunk, got on the first stage heading west into the mountains. I didn't care where it went, as long as it went where he wouldn't follow." The silence returned. It wasn't the awkward, oppressive silence of the first day. It was heavy with the weight of the truth. Boone unlaced his fingers. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a small tin of tobacco, and began rolling a cigarette with slow, methodical precision. "Man who hits a woman ain't a man," Boone said quietly, striking a match against the stone hearth. He touched the flame to the paper, taking a slow drag. The sweet, pungent smell of the smoke drifted across the room. "He's a frightened animal trying to prove he's got teeth." He blew a stream of smoke toward the rafters. "Is he looking for you?" Maeve felt a cold spike of dread in her gut. I don't know. He has the money to hire men who track things. People." Boone gave a short, single nod. He didn't look alarmed. He looked entirely undisturbed. He pinched the cherry of his cigarette out with his bare fingers and dropped the stub into his pocket. "Pass gets snowed in till April," Boone said, his voice flat, carrying the absolute certainty of the mountain. "Nobody tracks nothing through 10 feet of drift. If he sends men in the spring, they gotta come up the canyon." He stood up, looking down at her with those pale, chipped flint eyes. "Ain't no one coming up that canyon unless I say so. You're safe here." He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer a dramatic vow to protect her honor. He offered geography and ballistics, and it was the most profoundly comforting thing she had ever heard in her life. Maeve swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm useless here. I don't know how to cook over a fire. I don't know how to shoot. I dropped your skillet." Boone walked over to the table and picked up his heavy leather work gloves. "You survived 2 days in a freezing mud pit with a dull letter opener in your pocket," Boone said, pulling the gloves onto his massive hands. "You ain't useless. You just need to learn a new trade." He walked to the heavy door and threw the bolt. "I gotta dig out the mules. Stay in bed." The door opened, letting in a blinding shaft of sunlight and a rush of crisp, impossibly clean mountain air. He stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving Maeve alone in the quiet, smelling of bacon grease, old tobacco, and the sudden overwhelming scent of hope. The thaw took 3 days. The sun beat down on the mountain with a fierce, blinding intensity, turning the snowpack into a blinding glare of dripping water and slush. The sound of running water echoed everywhere, off the eaves of the roof, rushing through the swollen creek behind the cabin, dropping in heavy, wet thuds from the pine branches. Maeve's strength returned slowly. By the second day, she refused the cot. She took over the stove, learning through trial and burnt errors how to manage the heat of the coals. Boone let her. He didn't hover. He chopped wood, cleared the roof and checked his traps, returning at dusk, smelling of pine resin and cold wind. They moved around each other in a careful, quiet choreography. The silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a shared space, but as the snow melted, revealing the dark, muddy rut of the trail leading back down the mountain, a heavy, unspoken dread settled in Maeve's chest. The road was opening. The world was returning. On the 4th morning, Boone didn't go check his traps. Maeve stood at the window, wiping the condensation from the glass. She watched him back the 2 mules into their traces, hitching them to the battered buckboard wagon. The snow in the clearing was gone, replaced by thick, churning mud. Her stomach plummeted. It was time. The fever had broken, the road was clear, and her charity had run out. She was a stray he had taken in to weather the storm, and the storm was over. She turned away from the window, her hands trembling. She had nothing to pack. The ruined navy wool dress was folded on the rocking chair, but it was unwearable. She was still wearing his heavy red flannel shirt and her dried, stiff boots. The heavy door creaked open. Boone stepped inside, wiping the mud from his boots on the threshold. He didn't take off his coat. He stood by the door, his large frame filling the frame, blocking out the light. "Mules are hitched," he said, his voice stripped of emotion. Maeve gripped the back of the rocking chair, her knuckles turning white. She refused to cry. She had survived Arthur. She had survived the blizzard. She would survive whatever came next. "I don't have much to gather," she said, forcing a tight, polite smile that felt like it would crack her face in half. She picked up her ruined coat from the peg. "How much do I owe you?" "For the food. The medicine." Boone looked at her. He looked at the way she held her spine, rigid, the way her chin tilted up. The last, pathetic remnants of her high society armor. "Stagecoach comes through Bitter Creek tomorrow at noon," Boone said slowly. "Road's clear enough to make it down by nightfall. You can sleep in the assay office. Old man there owes me a favor." Maeve nodded stiffly. "Thank you for everything." She walked toward the door. She expected him to move aside. He didn't. He stood planted on the floorboards, an immovable wall of buffalo hide and muscle. Maeve stopped 2 feet from him, looking up into his weathered face. "Move, please," she whispered, her polite facade cracking. Boone reached up and pushed his slouch hat back on his head. "Told you the stage was running. Didn't tell you to get on it." Maeve froze. The air in the cabin suddenly felt very still. "What?" Boone looked away, staring at the cast-iron stove. It was the first time she had ever seen him look uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, his heavy boots creaking against the wood. "It's quiet here," he said, his voice low, scraping like a shovel against stone. "I like the quiet. Been alone up here 6 years. Don't much care for company." He paused, looking back at her. "But I don't much mind yours." It was a clumsy, inelegant admission, devoid of romance or poetry. It was a statement of raw, unvarnished fact. Maeve's breath hitched in her throat. "Boone!" "Life up here is hard," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto hers. He wasn't pleading, he was explaining the terms. "Winters are long, meat is tough, ain't no silk dresses or piano music, just mud, wood, and work." He reached out, his massive, scarred hand hovering in the air between them, palm up. He didn't touch her. He offered the space. "But you won't ever be cold," Boone said quietly. "You won't ever go hungry, and ain't no man ever gonna put his hands on your neck again." He looked at her, entirely vulnerable in his massive, quiet way. "You got a choice, Maeve. The road's open. Or," he nodded his head toward the stove, "or you can stay home, and we can eat supper." Maeve stared at his scarred hand. She thought of the stagecoach, the endless towns, the constant looking-over-her-shoulder paranoia. She thought of the cold, muddy street in Bitter Creek. Then she looked at the heavy iron skillet resting on the stove. She looked at the giant of a man who had carried her out of the snow, who had boiled bitter bark for her fever, who had given her his shirt and his silence. She let her ruined wool coat slip from her fingers. It hit the floorboards with a soft, dull thud. She didn't throw her arms around him. She didn't weep. She simply reached out and placed her small, pale hand into the center of his massive, calloused palm. His fingers closed around hers, a warm, rough, and absolute anchor. "I think," Maeve said, a genuine, quiet smile finally breaking across her face, "I'll figure out how not to drop the skillet." Boone's mouth twitched at the corner, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He squeezed her hand once, gently, before letting go. He turned back to the door, pulled it open, and shouted out to the yard. "Unhitch the mules!" He turned back to her, taking off his heavy coat and hanging it on the peg. "Stove's getting cold. Better get the fire up. Takes a while for the beans to boil." Maeve walked to the hearth, picked up the iron poker, and stirred the glowing red coals. The sparks flew up the chimney, bright and hot. The winter wasn't over, but the cold was gone. And that's the end of the trail for Maeve and Boone. From freezing in the mud to finding a fierce, quiet safety in the high mountains. Did you love this grounded, gritty romance? If this story gave you all the feels, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a real, rugged Western tale, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our next big story. What was your favorite moment in the cabin? Drop a comment below and let me know.